We're going to talk a little bit tonight about accountability at Atlantic Yards. As we mentioned, this is the fourth in a series of 4 public dialogues we've hosted over the last month. The Brooklyn Speaks Coalition was formed in 2006 to increase public engagement and improve accountability at Atlantic Yards. And our coalition members include the Atlantic Avenue LDC, the Boerum Hill Association, the Brooklyn Heights Association, Brown Community Development Corporation, CNU, NYC, Diaspora Community Services, the Fifth Avenue Committee, the Park Slope Civic Council, Impact Brooklyn, the North Flatbush Business Improvement District, the North Prospect Heights Association, and the Prospect Heights Neighborhood Development Council. And we've had 3 meetings so far. First was on urban design and street design, second on transportation, third on affordable housing, and tonight's meeting on accountability. If you have missed any of the previous meetings, you can go to the site you see on your screen here, crossroads.conveo.com, and from there, you can watch the presentations at those events, as well as leave feedback on what was presented. And since the purpose of this is to gather as much community input as possible at this phase, we certainly encourage you to make use of the Conveo site if you weren't able to go to the other events in person. So just a quick orientation around the Atlantic Yards project. It's largely bounded by Atlantic Avenue on the north, Vanderbilt Avenue on the east, Dean Street to the south, and Flatbush Avenue on the west. And then there's a bump out here for this block that's known as Site 5, now home to a PC Richards and a former Modell's location. That's between Flatbush Avenue, Atlantic Avenue, 4th Avenue, and Pacific Street. And as we alluded to earlier, the new district lines that are about to be voted on tomorrow, as Assemblymember Cahill pointed out, did divide up some new representation for this area and the areas around it as well. Looking at the current state of the project, we'd like to once again show you this graphic that was conceived and by Norman Oder of the AtlanticYardsReport.com site. This is what's been built so far. We have the arena having been completed, the 461 Dean building, which is a mixed affordable and market rate building. I'm going to kind of go in sequence here. The next 2 buildings were 550 Vanderbilt and 535 Carlton Avenue. 550 Vanderbilt is a market rate condominium building. 535 Vanderbilt is an affordable building. Following that was 38 6th Avenue, another affordable building. And under construction now are B15, which is at the southeast corner of 6th Avenue and Dean Street, B4, which is at the southeast corner of 6th Avenue, southwest corner of 6th Avenue and Atlantic Avenue, and B12 and 13 that are each on the block of Dean Street between Vanderbilt Avenue and Carlton Avenue. What is unbuilt is what you see in the lighter shade down here, which are 6 buildings that belong over the Vanderbilt rail yards on the blocks between Atlantic Avenue, Pacific Street, 6th Avenue, and Vanderbilt Avenue. Likewise, this building here is expected for Site 5 across Flatbush Avenue from Barclays Center. In each case, various things have held up the construction of these buildings. There was litigation between PC Richard and the developers regarding PC Richard's ability to maintain a presence on that lot and new space in that building. That litigation, we understand to have been settled in October. And here on along the rail yards, this has been kind of a grind in terms of getting a contractor mobilized and all of the necessary approvals from the MTA and perhaps other factors that are not transparent to us. The concern that we have at this point is that because so much affordable housing is yet to be built, and the 877 units that have not been built are all slated to go on a platform above the rail yard here. It's extremely likely that there will be a failure to meet the May 2025 deadline for completion of all affordable housing units. At the same time, now that the litigation has been settled for Site 5, it looks as though the plan the developers have is to relocate density that was planned for a building where the plaza in front of the arena is across the street to Site 5. We're concerned that the state potentially could move forward with approving such a transfer, thereby adding to the value of Site 5 to the developers' benefit at a time when it seems like the same developers will be unable to make their affordable housing commitment here on the rail yards. And this brings us squarely to our topic for this evening of accountability. Here's kind of a list of some of the public benefits that were claimed for the project at the time it was approved in 2006, together with the status of where they are today. Although the arena is opened and the subway entrance next to the arena has been completed and the healthcare center at 38th 6th Avenue has opened, the other commitments either have not been fully realized or have not been begun with no plans announced. Some of these are very, very important to the local community. Certainly 2,250 affordable rental apartments was a key cornerstone pledge of the project at its announcement and through its approval. As of now, only 781 of those apartments are occupied. We have last week had a session on affordable housing where we discussed some of the issues related to affordability levels in those apartments. And certainly there's an unmet promise, we believe, to house people at risk of displacement in this district, not so much of a focus on the middle income apartments that have been made available so far. The project's supposed to produce 200 affordable ownership apartments. No plans for those have been announced that we're aware of. We do not have any plans announced for office and hotel space yet. Of the 8 acres of open space, less than an acre is complete now. The urban room, which was supposed to be a public meeting space in the building in front of the arena, which no longer appears to be on the drawing board, there's been no plans to replace that announced elsewhere in the project. And likewise, the intergenerational facility has not had any further movement. So the question we ask ourselves at this point is, how did we get here? How is it that 16 years after the project was approved by the PACB and more than 18 years after it was announced, we're still in a place where so much of the project seems to be up in the air with key commitments in doubt? Well, we want to start by kind of talking about governance from the perspective of what redevelopment approval in New York City is like. Typically, this happens through a process called the City's Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, or ULURP. And ULURP begins with a project being certified and then being heard in a hearing hosted by the community board, which then is able to advise changes to the project. It then goes to the borough president, who has another public hearing, gets more input, and adds his or her own set of recommendations to what should be done with the project. And from there, it goes to the City Planning Commission, and there's a public hearing held again. The City Planning Commission is given the authority to modify the project directly or reject it. If it moves forward from there, it then goes to the New York City Council, where additional modifications to the project can be made, and then a legislative approval or rejection is finally voted on. Now, that last point is really key. When you look at all of these entities that participate in the ULURP process, you have a community board that's been appointed by the borough president and city council members. You have a borough president that's been elected by voters in the borough where the project's located. You have a city planning commission that's been appointed by the mayor of the city of New York, and you have a city council elected by the voters of New York City, with deference usually to the support of the local city council member. So this is a process that involves multiple parts of government that have different different relationships to the voters, and with multiple public hearings. Now, how did this work in the case of Atlantic Yards? Well, basically, this didn't work in the case of Atlantic Yards. This was not the way that the Atlantic Yards project was approved. Instead, Atlantic Yards was approved under what's called the New York State Urban Development Corporation Act, which works differently than the ULURP process. Typically, in a UDC project, Empire State Development formulates a project with a developer and then performs an environmental review of its impacts. Once the environmental review has been adopted by the ESD's board, the process goes to the Public Authority Control Board, which either approves or rejects the project. It's an up or down vote. And then it goes back to the ESD, who then negotiates the final project terms and approves any future changes to the project. And that last part is important in this case, because that's the function of the ESD in a scenario where a transfer of development rights is requested by the developer. Now, you can see the difference between this and the ULURP process. It's not just that it's a more streamlined process. What you have is a public agency whose board is wholly appointed by the governor, a public authority control board whose members are appointed by the governor, the state senate majority leader, and the speaker of the assembly. This is where, in part, where the phrase 3 men in a room comes from. And then, once it goes back to the ESD, from that point on, any changes to the project are solely in the hands of the governor's appointees. So there's very little representation sort of outside of the governor here. And there's really no requirement for public hearing and input of the type that is typical of other redevelopment projects in New York City. One of the reasons that developers like the UDC process is because it gives them a number of benefits. First, you're able to bypass public review of large development projects. There's no need to go to the community board, the borough president, the city planning commission, or the city council. This can all kind of be handled on an expedited basis with the Empire State Development Corporation. Second, projects that are approved under UDC have the ability to override local limits on building height and bulk, uses, and parking. So they really have a broad ability to circumvent other kinds of local regulation. And then finally, UDC also permits the assembling of property through the use of eminent domain, which was done at Atlantic Yards and which is also being discussed as a potential tool at the Penn Station project now, which is a similar project to Atlantic Yards, and then it's intended to be implemented through UDC. So that's how we got started. And in the 16 years since Atlantic Yards was approved, this project has gone through 5 governors, 3 mayors, and 2 master developers. The project started off with Forest City Ratner, but Forest City Ratner later sold its rights in the project to Greenland USA, a US subsidiary of Greenland Holdings, which is a Shanghai-based developer. So none of the people you see here on the left are associated with the project anymore. Here is Bruce Ratner, who was the original developer. Next to him was Michael Bloomberg, who was the mayor at the time. David Patterson, who is the governor, Marty Markowitz, who is the borough president in Brooklyn, and then on Marty's left is Jay-Z. You haven't heard from any of these people about Atlantic Yards recently because they're really not involved. And although Atlantic Yards is a $6 billion project, it's my understanding Empire State Development has only one full-time staff member assigned to the project. So there's really not a lot of management on the state's part built into a very, very large and sensitive development project that has a significant number of public commitments. So under the project agreements, the master developer has the right to sell some or all of the lots at Atlantic Yards to other developers. Changes to the Atlantic Yards project are adopted through closed-door negotiations between the master developer and ESD, kind of like what I showed you on the slide before. Now, in 2014, as part of a settlement, we helped negotiate with the state and the developer. The state agreed to create the Atlantic Yards Community Development Corporation to oversee the project's public commitments and advise the ESDC board on future changes. So the Atlantic Yards CDC has a board that includes members that are appointed by local elected officials. The problem here is AYCDC's charter requires its board meet 4 times each year, but ESD has not observed that requirement. So the effectiveness of what Atlantic Yards CDC has been able to accomplish has been limited by the fact that it just hasn't met as frequently as was agreed at the time of its creation. If you look around the city, you see that other large development projects in New York that have been successful had a lot more involvement and coordination between state and city governments. The Battery Park City Authority was very involved in the redevelopment of that part of Lower Manhattan. The Queens West Development Corporation was, kind of a joint venture between ESD and EDC. Brooklyn Bridge Park Corporation as well has a broad base of stakeholders. The Port Authority is involved with it. The EDC and the City of New York also involved. So these are projects that are, they're challenging projects like Atlantic Yards, but they have real infrastructure to support getting them executed over time and adapting to changing conditions. This is a model we believe needs to be seriously considered for Atlantic Yards at this point. It's pretty clear the hands-off management at Atlantic Yards hasn't worked. And we're close to a cycle where it looks like another type of a bailout or a renegotiation might be in the works. So we believe it's time for a different approach. We believe it's time for local control and accountability. And at this point, I'll turn the presentation over to Regina Cahill from the North Flatbush bid.
Thanks, Gib. Good evening, everyone. Gib, do I have control to advance the slides? Is that?
I'll still flip the slides for you.
So as we thought about, if you just stay on the other slide for a minute.
Oops,
wrong way. So as we thought about this lack of transparency, lack of accountability, the one staff member, we looked for some historic precedent of major projects as large as Atlantic Yards that had more local control. And so what we found with the help of Ron Schiffman, our planner extraordinaire, was the Harlem Urban Development Corporation that was formed in 1975 and is currently still active in a slightly different iteration. But what it really did is provide for local control over the development, and that's what we're hoping to achieve here. So as we discussed different ways to create local control, we came up with, next slide, Brooklyn Crossroads Local Development Corporation, which would have fluid interaction and communication and oversight, by the various local and governmental agencies at the state and federal level. So the paradigm would be there would be representatives from the mayor, which would represent the agencies like the NYPD, the Department of Buildings, Environmental Protection, Housing Preservation and Development, DOT, and Sanitation. The governor's office, which would appoint two, which would include the chair, so it would still suffice for having governor control because the chair would be an appointee, but they would represent ESD, the MTA, and maybe Long Island Railroad as separate entities. And then at the state level, there would be 4 appointees, and mostly their funding, their purpose would be more to look at the funding and the sustainability of the project and see how this could move forward. At the borough president and city council level, there would be 2 appointees, which would really be a major focus of planning and quality of life. The overall purpose of this, the sole mandate, would be to ensure the completion of the project while managing the negative real-time impacts of both quality of life from daytime construction and nighttime event activities. So they will be responsible for development, operations, safety and security, quality of life. And the governor would appoint a chair, but can't outvote local stakeholders. And all the appointees must be Brooklyn residents. Next slide. So what would ensure the accountability for the future design of the remaining development sites, ensure the affordable housing meets the targets and the community needs, to look at the open space proposal and to see that it's truly open space. Right now, there is a Pacific Park Conservancy, which is basically controlled by the current buildings that are built and their stakeholders there. The incorporation papers are primarily staff members with some tacit participation from the community board. And then to look at the environmental impacts, both short-term and long-term. Next. It would certainly, under future design, would look at the transfer of the density among the lots in the project. That they must be contingent upon the developers engaging in the community in a meaningful way regarding the design of buildings and the streetscapes. So if you look back at our previous presentations, we talked a lot about the streetscapes, the design, traffic flow, and also the housing affordability. Programming must include space for large community gatherings to be administered by a nonprofit steward, not affiliated with the project developers, or by a city cultural institution such as the Brooklyn Public Library. Next slide. The affordable housing. Until 75% of the affordable units are complete, 25% of the floor area in a new building must be reserved for affordable housing. Any transfer of development rights of lots must be subject to a binding public commitment by the transferee to provide the number of affordable apartments called out for that parcel in current agreements between the state and the developer. Increased density at Site 5 must include additional commitments for affordable housing targeting very low and extremely low income tenants who've been left behind by the Atlantic Yards housing completed to date. Next slide. Open space. This is probably the biggest misnomer. The open space is a total of 8 acres, but it's divided between the buildings. So all of the 8 acres of the project open space obligations should be designated public park, public playground, private park, or private court, and plans developed for each condition in consultation with the community. Next. The environmental impacts. The state and city must fund a system for collecting and resolving reports from community members of environmental impacts from construction. For those of us who've been around for a while, we probably remember all of the different websites that we were trying to create to collect data, and none of this ever came to fruition. Next. The state and city must create and fund a special enforcement district bounded by a 5-block radius around the project footprint. Officers will patrol this service area to monitor and enforce construction, parking, environmental, and health and safety violations. So as we move into the discussion period, we'd like you to think about these kinds of questions. Who should determine what additional public benefits are warranted when Atlantic Yards developers receive additional rights? So that really speaks to the trade-off. Can they go up 80 stories if they give us another acre of parkland, another school? Those are kinds of considerations that have been thrown our way. What should be done to ensure the project delivers on its public commitments? Those are mostly around affordable housing, the school, quality of life. How should safety and quality of life complaints at and around the project be managed? And then how should the public be involved in the planning for the remainder of the project as we go forward? So that's our presentation. We're going to move into breakout groups, which Gib will send you to.